Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. And thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast, and listen to it in your car or your truck as you're driving along, or stick in those earbuds and listen to it on public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the insanely outrageous lie that the only slavery that ever occurred throughout the entire sweep of human history was the transatlantic slavery, where whites were enslaving black Africans. This is grotesquely untrue. Yet, if you look at the history curricula around nearly all the Western countries, it focuses on this. There's no mention of any other type of slavery ever. And the only culprits, or the baddies, are white people, and the only victims are black. And it's just simply untrue, not even remotely true, not even a tiny little bit true. So let's have a look at that. Now, we need to understand that the globalist agenda is to eradicate white people, white society, and white culture. White people just get in the way of the globalist project, and it's that simple, and they've got to be got rid of. And it's a form of intellectual genocide, in my view, that the only people that want free and fair elections, independent courts, and rule of law and due legal process, the only people that want that are effectively white people, particularly white men, and so they have to be got rid of. And a great way, or one way of doing that, is, and if you control the entire media narrative, you can get away with it to some extent anyway, is to accuse white people of terrible moral crimes against others. And in that way, you can shame, blame, humiliate, degrade, and do all. So really, we're looking at a part of the wider globalist play to again, shame, blame, and so on white people, regardless of whether they played any significant role or any role in what went on. So let's get some perspective. One, I guess a few things that sort of surprised me is the blatant nature of the lies that occur in this slavery discussion. And are you saying we shouldn't teach history of what evil fucking white Nazis did? No one's actually saying that. But slavery occurred. The transatlantic slavery occurred as a matter of historical fact. So if you're teaching history, of course it wouldn't be ignored. Why should it be? Let's talk about all the other slaveries that throughout human history have occurred. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about how the black tribes enslaved each other. Let's talk about how the Zulus enslaved and annihilated other tribes in Africa. Let's talk about all the slaveries throughout time. Slaveries in the Middle East, thousands of years ago. How slaves were used all over Britain, as in the Irish enslaving the Welsh, or what was been, the Irish enslaving sort of Western Scotland, and it just went on. Slavery was seen as a form of labour exchange or gene pool freshening up. So it wasn't seen as one human being owning another. That's the modern interpretation, which is used again specifically and uniquely to try and shame and blame white people. But it wasn't perceived as one race. White people enslaving each other, black people enslaving each other, Asian people enslaving each other. Pacific Islander people enslaving each other. This idea that it was race related is nonsense, and again is a modern phenomenon, and again is a tool or a device used to uniquely shame and blame white people. So let's just go through some of this. Now, I've covered some of these things before. I don't mind. I've got no problem. Some don't like it, but I don't mind if transatlantic slavery, the history of it, because again, it's historical fact. So if you're teaching history, you teach historical fact. That's kind of how it works. But let's talk about all the other slaveries. Let's have many lessons about how the black tribes enslaved and mass murdered each other. Let's have history lessons about how the black chieftains and warlords and that sort of thing, how they would enslave their fellow Africans. and whether from their own tribe or a neighbouring tribe doesn't matter, but enslave their fellow Africans and sell them for chump change to the Arab slave traders. Why aren't we talking about the Arab slave trade? Let's go into detail on that. Let's talk about the mass castration of black slaves. It wasn't done in the most hygienic conditions, and many of them died, as you can imagine, from the from the very rudimentary surgical procedures of the time. Let's talk about the slavery of all peoples and all areas at all times. Let's cover it, all of it in detail, and let's have a look. And once you sort of do that throughout the sweep of history, the ancient Athenians that were the ancient what today would be the I suppose the Serbians of the day. I'm going back thousands of years now. How they enslaved the Assyrians, the Egyptians. The list goes on. Now, I've noticed that the woke history is when the Egyptians were enslaving other people, suddenly they become white. And then we're talking about the great achievements of the Egyptians, their goldsmithing and their building of pyramids. Suddenly the Egyptians become black. I noticed that jump. I was very, very deft sleight of hand there. So, but if we look at, given the sparse nature of populations back in the day, and really until the modern era to a large extent, if you wanted a workforce, you had to import it, and that meant typically you had to engage in some form of slavery or indenturing, which was a nice way of saying you've got white slaves in the modern era. But the difference between the rights of a slave and an indentured servant, say in the early colonial America, or even after independence, the difference was very small. You'd struggle to see daylight in the difference of how the two might be viewed. So when we look at slavery, history tells us slavery has been practiced at all times, but it's been a labour exchange thing. There's been no desire by this group to whether it be on skin colour or something else, by this group to enslave another group. It hasn't been based on, it's been based on labour and the need for a workforce. Now, there are some other factors, again, which I've mentioned in previous videos. The reason the black people were, or the Africans, were really looked at as a pool of labour was manifold. The first is that even back in the day, the population of the black countries or sub-Saharan African countries or areas was much higher than the procreation rate and thus the overall population rate of pretty much anywhere else in the world, I would think. Maybe some of the tropical Asian places, parts of China and India, that sort of thing. But the second thing was, so there was a large population pool to pick from. The second thing was how easily the black chieftains would sell out their own citizens. It must be a bit like the globalization today, how white elites so carelessly sell out their own white citizens. But back in the day, it was the black chieftains selling out the white citizens, selling out their fellow black citizens. So that was very easy. So there was no pushback. There was no wars that were needed to go and grab these slaves. Far from it. The black chieftains couldn't have been more willing to hand over capturing their own people and shipping them or taking them to the coastal ports where the transatlantic shipping ports were for the slave trade. So the next thing was the black or the Africans were immune to, or pretty much immune to, white people's diseases, the smallpoxes, those sort of things. Or they were no less susceptible to those diseases than white people were, and the numbers that perish in things like smallpox epidemics suggest that they were less susceptible than white people were. So so they were very hardy in terms of diseases, or resistance rather to diseases. So this again sort of brought them back into the option of, because if they'd been very susceptible to white people's diseases, such as smallpox and so on, diphtheria or whatever, then they would have been useless as workers. So who else have we got? But the fact that they were highly resistant to that, in fact more resistant than really any other group, meant that they came again to the top of the list of options and possibilities. The next thing was doing heavy work. A lot of the other groups, tribes, peoples, Caribbean peoples, North American Indians, and so on and so forth, were deemed unable to do the heavy work, or were so lazy, it was asserted, that the minute the overseer or the foreman sort of went off to do something else, they would all stop work until he came back, things like that. So they viewed that on a relative basis, even though they complained about the black laziness, on a relative basis, they were the best workers, particularly where heavy work was involved, or working in hot climates and hot circumstances. They were much better workers than any of the other groups. So this again put them to the top of the list. Because they would procreate quite prodigiously, far more than, say, North American Indians or the Caribbean tribes would. When you brought slaves, like men and women, you brought slaves to an area, you could begin after a period of time through natural procreation. You could, because slaves were expensive, so you could develop a working population from the procreation of the initial slaves, rather than having to bring new slaves in. So all these things combined made the African slave or the African option of a labor exchange, because that's what it was back then. It wasn't one person trying to own another. Far from it. It was a labor exchange at the time. We see it differently today, of course, through a different moral lens, but at the time it was, how do we get a workforce? And how do we get a workforce that isn't going to die of diseases? How do we get a workforce that will tolerate the hot conditions? How do we get a workforce that's numerous enough that we can actually, how can we get a workforce where the local chieftains will sell them to us for a song? All these sort of things were factors, and combined to, and also the proximity to Europe. Technically they could have gone and got Indian, for example, in any populous area, they could have got Indian slaves or Chinese slaves or something like that, because those were hugely populous at the time. But that was a long way to go, and because of the closeness to Europe, a week or so of sailing time to get to the coastal port in Africa. Then, because of that, it was just convenient, far more convenient to get to. Now, in spite of that, and there's claims that the slave ships, everybody died, all the slaves died, and because they were so maltreated. Well, that's insane. The cost of running a ship with the crew, and the cost of having to buy the slaves, the cost of the distance, the journey, it could be anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather and so on, before you got to the Caribbean or the North American places like Virginia and so on, to sell the slaves. And when they got there, there was rigorous examination of the slaves. The slaves were special buying agents who were experts in human health and that sort of thing, would be looking at the teeth. The slaves had to perform various tasks such as running and jumping and swinging from chandeliers or whatever, to show and prove that they were fit and healthy. And any blemish like a carbuncle or boils or anything like that was seen as that would reduce the price that the people were prepared to pay. So you're looking at a fully healthy slave could fetch $800. For example. Now remember, this is hundreds of years ago. $800 was serious coin at the time. So that would reflect the cost of acquiring the slaves, the transport, and then the ship's got to go back. It was an expensive business. The auctioneer wants a slice of the action, and the list goes on. So the slaves had to arrive in tip-top condition. Tip-top condition. Now, if they were packed in like sardines, as was claimed, over 6 weeks, and they weren't fed, and they were beaten and whipped and this and that, the deaths would have been, you would have arrived at the other end with hardly a slave still alive, and the ones that were alive would have been in wretched physical condition. They wouldn't have fetched a dime at the auction. So you had to get, they had to arrive at the other end in tip-top physical condition if they were going to score the $800. Now there are stories where, say there was an outbreak of some sort of disease on the ship, the transport ship, and the slaves all had the disease, and they had to be, in effect, dysentery, for example, had broken out on the ship. Let's say that. So they'd all arrived, or many had arrived in poor condition. Now, when they arrive in this poor condition, dysentery, and they're looking undernourished and looking pretty bad, you'd be lucky to get $50 for a slave, and some would even sort of argue, well, $25 is the best I'm going to do, because it's going to cost me hundreds of dollars to get this guy back up to being fit enough and healthy enough that he can do the heavy work on the farm or the plantation. So we need to understand the economics of that. The economics demanded that you had as many slaves in tip-top physical condition that would arrive at the other end, and if you didn't have that, you would lose money, and a lot of it. So now, if they all arrived in tip-top condition, you could get $800 a throw, then the journey was a huge success. Or the commercial transaction was a huge success. So this is something that they just don't teach. So somehow the slavers would pack them in like sardines, they'd all die, and somehow they managed to, it just never made sense. It's ridiculous. But this is not taught in schools either. So the real argument, or the real complaint about how slavery is taught today, and willfully and deceitfully and treacherously, in my view, done so, is that they infer, by omission as much as lying, which certainly telling lies, is that the only slavery that ever occurred in human history was whites enslaving blacks. It was evil, immoral. It was only done because of racism. It was only done because of fascist, Nazi, bigot, Hitler, xenophobe, and it's all woven into it. Have you noticed how many of these people that talk about slavery go from slavery to Hitler within a sentence? They just marry the two together to indicate the moral the moral degeneracy of white people. All slavers were Hitler, and well, hold on, slavery's been. What's that got to do with Hitler? No, nobody knows, but they just throw it together because it's a nice emotive narrative. So I'm all for teaching again, if it occurred, if it was a factual event of history, then teach it, for goodness sakes. But teach it all and make sure it's fully understood. I was looking at a video, something online a little while ago, where there was a supposed history academic, and this very overweight Coca-Cola type bottle glasses. Midget white chick who's cat lady type thing, and it just illustrated how they cherry pick an event from history and assert that it was a moral issue that white people have to answer for, and they seem to be quite adept at doing this. But as they get no pushback from education authorities, no pushback from the media, no pushback anywhere, they can get away with it. But only because of that, only because there's no pushback, only because they're not held to account. And again, this is part of the wider globalist thing to shame, blame, and humiliate white society. But this lecture mentioned that a black guy was hung, and there was quite a crowd turned up to see it. And when the hanging was done, this is in America, centuries ago. When when it's done, people were and the crowd came forward. The guy's dead, to cut off bits of his clothing, or bits of his body, like a finger or a toe or something like that. and that just shows the evil white people, the evilness of white people. This is beyond evil. When that's the guy in question, as I understand it, was supposedly had murdered 50 odd people, and it was a notorious case, and it was widely publicized, and people come along to have a look. And by the way, public hangings and executions were widely, people were encouraged to come. In England, in Europe, generally, when there was a public execution, this is all white people, by the way, and a white person getting executed, people would come along. There was all sorts of things going, like balladeers would write songs for money. You paid them, and they would write songs about the the exploits or the misdeeds or whatever of the person who was getting executed. And there were people setting up stalls to sell food and drink and ale and and so on. So it was viewed as something as that people came to see, and that was still the case in America. But the way the academic puts it is that it was evil white people coming to watch a black person being killed because they're so racist and bigoted and xenophobic. It's not that at all. That's an absolute lie. That was how things were at the time. And we look back today and think how gory and unpleasant and bloodthirsty it all was. At a time when the average age of people was 30 than when they died, it was a very different world and a very different view on a whole lot of things then. And to try and paint it in terms of it's a racist issue is not true. And we should remember that when people who claim to have religious powers, for example, when they died, people would cut off bits of them and keep thinking that their religious power was somehow endowed in a finger or a toe. And so this was something that just went on. It was how people behaved and the superstitious type beliefs that many had at the time. It had nothing to do with racism and the way it's depicted by this academic who's, again, the cherry picking. So the very careful cherry picking and curating of a narrative that only makes white people look bad and makes everyone else appear a victim, of course, is utter nonsense. And we should push back against that and should push back vigorously. And I'm looking for certainly politicians that will take that view. But the globalists want that. That's part of the globalist the numerous devices they use to undermine and degrade white society. And we need to push back against that and push back vigorously. You've been Tassus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.